The Iron Knife. Characters: Kalaunuiohua, King of Hawaii; Kalaunuiohua, King of Maui; Huapo'ulele, Ali'inui of Oahu; Kahokuohua, King of Molokai; Kukona, King of Kauai; Kaheka, Queen of Hawaii; Kuaiva, son of the King of Hawaii; Kapapa, daughter of the King of Hawaii; Waahia, a renowned prophetess; Kualu, adopted son of Waahia; Vakalana, an influential chief of Maui; Kalu'iki Amanu, Hakoa and Hika, shipwrecked foreigners; males, Neleike and Malaya, shipwrecked foreigners; females, Mano Kalanipo, son of the King of Kauai. The Iron Knife, a legend of the first war for the conquest of the group. 1. 2 or 3 attempts to consolidate under one general government the several islands of the Hawaiian group were made by ambitious and warlike chiefs previous to the final accomplishment of the project, at the close of the last century, by Kamehameha the Great. But all these early schemes of conquest and aggrandizement proved unsuccessful, and were especially unfortunate in affording excuses for retaliatory raids and invasions, sometimes extending, with more or less persistency and bitterness, to generations thereafter. The most disastrous of these ambitious ventures was the first, and connected with it were a number of strange and dramatic incidents, giving to the story of the enterprise something more than a historic interest. It occurred in about AD 1260, and the bold warrior who attempted it was Kalaunuiohua, king of the island of Hawaii. He was the grandson of Kalapana, who reconquered the kingdom from Kamaiole, the usurper, as related in the story of the Royal Hunchback. At that time, Kalaunuiohua, the seventh in descent from Paumakua, was the moi of Maui, or rather of the western and greater part of the island. Huapo'ulele, the eighth in line from Ma'veke, was the Ali'inui of Oahu, his possessions embracing the districts of Ewa, Waianae, and Waialua, while the Ko'olau and Kona divisions were ruled, respectively, by Moku'aloi and Kahuoi. The moi of Molokai was Kahokuohua, the fourth in descent in the old Nanaula line from Keoloewa, the brother of Kaupeapei, the abductor of Haina, and desperate defender of the fortress of Haupu, as told in the legend of Haina, the Hawaiian Helen. Kukona was the sovereign of Kauai. He was the great-grandson of Ahu Kini'ala'a, one of the 3 sons of the 3 wives of La'amai Kahiki, as mentioned in the story of the triple marriage of La'amai Kahiki. The contemporary rulers of the several islands are thus referred to for the reason that they all appear as prominent actors in the several legends from which have been gathered the historic features of the story about to be related, and also for the purpose of keeping partially in view the conspicuous and succeeding representatives of the sovereign families of the group. Kalaunuiohua, or, as he will be called hereafter, Kalaunui, inherited something of the military spirit of his warlike grandfather, and is referred to by tradition as an ambitious and aggressive sovereign, courageous in enterprise, but lacking in judgment and discretion. This estimate of his character is abundantly sustained by the record of his acts. Waipio had been made the focus of sovereign authority by Kahai Mo'elea, the royal father of Kalaunui, and continued to be the most attractive and consequential point in the kingdom. The royal grounds and edifices had been enlarged and improved from time to time, until barbaric taste and skill seemed to be able to add nothing more to their grandeur or beauty. Not far from the royal mansion was the great Hei'o of Paka'alani, partially built by Kalapana, and completed by his successor. Its tabus were the most sacred on Hawaii, and a descendant of Pa'ao officiated there as high priest. It was connected with the palace enclosure by a sacred stone pavement, which it was death for any but royal and privileged feet to touch. And on its walls were over 100 gods. Kalaunui was proud of his ancestry, which carried back his lineage both to Pili and Maveka, and united in his veins the foremost blood of the pioneers of the 5th and 11th centuries. He had 2 children, a son named Kwaiva, and a daughter, Kapapa, whose full name was Kapapa Limu Limu. At the time of which we are writing, she was 15, and her brother was 3 or 4 years older. Both had been carefully reared. The son had been instructed in all the manly accomplishments of the time, and from her infancy the daughter had been guarded with the most jealous watchfulness. She had grown almost to womanhood without betrothal, for the reason that a husband suited to her rank and personally deserving of her beauty could with difficulty be found in the kingdom. Among the number of the king's retainers of various grades of rank, beginning with the wohi, or chief counselor of royal blood next to the throne, and ending with the kahu ali'i and puku, or personal and other attendants at the palace, was the young chief Kwalu. He was large, muscular, and handsome, with a bearing indicative of good blood, and through his courage and capacity at arms had been raised to the military position of Pukaua, or captain, and placed in charge of the palace guard, an office which gave him, if he did not before possess it, the privilege of an aialo, or the right to eat food in the presence of the king. Kwalu was a chief without possessions. His grandfather, a chief of the old line of Nanaula, had been killed in the battle which restored Kalapana to the throne of his fathers, and on the sudden death of his father, 20 years before, he had been adopted by Waahia, a kola, or prophetess, renowned in tradition for her foresight and influence. He was recognized by the Aha Ali'i, or College of Chiefs of established lineage, as of noble blood, but belonged to that class of chiefs who, lacking the influence of family and estates, were compelled to rely upon their own efforts for advancement. Although it is claimed that Waahia was of chiefly lineage, nothing is positively known, even of her parents. She first appeared in Waipio more than a generation before, and, through an almost undeviating verification of her prophecies, in time became noted and feared by the people, not only as a favored devotee of Uli, the god of the sorcerers, but as a medium through whom the Unipihili, or spirits of the dead, communicated. She lived alone in a hut in a retired part of the valley of Waipio, and it is said that a large pueo, or owl, which, with the white ele, was sacred and sometimes worshipped, came nightly and perched upon the roof of her lonely habitation. Of course, a kaula of her sanctity wanted for nothing. The people were only too happy to leave at her door anything of which she might stand in need, and the best of everything in the valley came unbidden to her board. Of her abundance, she gave to the needy, and, while she seldom spoke to anyone, her looks and acts were kind to all. The priesthood recognized her power, and the king and chiefs consulted her in matters of moment when the kilos of the temple were in doubt. She had reared Kwalu with the greatest care, and saw him grow to a manhood of which she was proud. She loved him as if he had been her own child, and he repaid her affection by heeding her advice in all things, and by kindness comforting her declining years. She had schooled him in a lore which but few possessed, and the most skillful had instructed him in the martial and courtly accomplishments consistent with his chiefly rank. At the age of 20, he became attached to the household of the king, and in time was advanced, as already stated, to the high grade of captain of the palace guard. Although his abilities had commended him to advancement, his early favor with the king was doubtless due to some extent to the influence of his foster mother. Kwalu's intimate connection with the royal household brought him into frequent companionship with Kwaiva and his sister, and as the latter grew to womanhood, a romantic attachment sprang up between her and the handsome captain of the guard. It was romantic only because it was to every appearance hopeless, for there was a wide gulf between Kualu and the daughter of the proudest moi in all the group, and for whom there seemed to be no fitting mate. The home of Kualu was within the palace enclosure, yet he frequently visited Waahia in her lonely retreat to cheer her with words of affection and see that she wanted for nothing. It was during one of these visits, not long before the beginning of the leading events of this legend, that the kaula abruptly said to him, "Kualu, I can see that you are thinking much of Ka Papa." "We sometimes meet," replied Kualu evasively. "It is not well for you to try to gather berries from the clouds," returned the kaula kindly. "A niapio of the highest rank alone can reach that fruit. The flying spear brings down what the hand cannot reach," was Kualu's significant answer. Waahia smiled at the dauntless spirit of her ward, and after a long pause, during which she sat thoughtfully, with her eyes fixed upon the ground, said, "Your hopes are bold, but the gods are great. Come to me tomorrow." The next day, Kualu was made joyful by the words of Waahia. She told him that she had been given a view of something of his future, and that the auguries promised so much that she could not discourage even the most audacious of his aspirations. But that coming events affecting his life were so mingled with wars and strange faces of a race she had never seen except in dreams, that she could then advise no definite course of action. With these vague words of encouragement, Kualu returned to the palace, and authoritatively learned, what had for some time been rumored, that preparations were to be speedily made for an invasion of Maui, and possibly of the other islands of the group. Having brought all the districts of Hawaii under his control, Kalaunui entertained the ambitious design of uniting the several islands of the archipelago under one government. In this grand scheme of conquest and consolidation, he was sustained by the leading chiefs of Hawaii, hungering for foreign possessions, and large quotas of canoes and warriors were promised. A general plan of action having been adopted, a fleet of 2,000 canoes of all sizes and an army of 12,000 warriors were speedily collected. Sacrifices were made at the great temple of Pakaalani. The favor of the gods was invoked, and the auguries were satisfactory. The king was to lead the expedition in person, and the chivalry of the kingdom rallied to his support. His double canoe, nearly 40 paces in length, was gorgeous in royal colors and trappings, and more than 100 others bore at their mastheads the ensigns of distinguished chiefs. No such warlike display had been seen by the generation witnessing it, and the confidence and enthusiasm of the king and his commanding officers were fully shared by the people. Leaving the government in the hands of his young son Kuaiva, with Kaheka, the queen mother, as principal adviser, Kalaunui ordered the warriors to their canoes, and with his aides and personal attendants repaired to the beach to superintend the departure of the expedition in person. In charge of his high priest, his newly decorated war god had been taken aboard, and the king was about to follow when Waahia, whose foster son was one of the leaders in the enterprise, approached the royal kaulua. She was clad in a pau and short mantle, and her long white hair fell below her shoulders. Her form was bent, and she carried a staff for support. At the sight of the venerable figure, familiar to everyone in Waipio, the king turned and said, "I am glad you are here. Encouragement comes from the temple. What says Waahia?" "Good in the beginning, bad in the end," was the blunt response of the prophetess. "I am instructed by your cheering assurances," adroitly returned the king, observing that her words had been overheard. "The true meaning is that it would be bad to abruptly end a good beginning." Saying which, With something of a scowl, he hastily stepped into his kaulua and gave the signal for departure. Without replying, Waahia, fully believing that disaster would overtake the expedition in the end, and anxious to be near Kaulau when it came, entered one of the many canoes set apart for the women and other camp followers of the invading army, and with the fleet set sail for Maui. 2. While the Hawaiian army, cheered by chants of battle and beating of war drums, is buffeting the waves on its way to Maui, let us glance again at the moi of that island and the political condition of his possessions. While Kalaunuiohua was the nominal sovereign of the island, the extreme eastern portion of it continued to be governed by independent chiefs. The principal chief of the windward side was Wakalana, whose residence was at Wailuku. He was a cousin of the moi, and their relations were exceedingly friendly. 2 years before a remarkable event had occurred at Wailuku. It was the second appearance in the group of a vessel bearing people of a strange race, described by tradition as white with bright, shining eyes. Mention is made of other white people who were brought to the islands on one or more occasions by the Argonauts of earlier generations, notably by Paumakua of Oahu, who near the close of the 11th century returned from one of his exploring voyages with 3 white persons of an unknown race. But this was the second time that a vessel of a people other than Polynesian had been seen in Hawaiian waters. The first made a landing near Makapu Point, on the island of Oahu, more than 100 years before. Tradition has preserved the name of the vessel, Ulupana, and of the captain, Mololano, and his wife, Malai'a. But as it is not mentioned that they remained in the country, it is probable that they soon re-embarked. The second arrival is more distinctly marked by tradition. It was a Japanese vessel that had been dismantled by a typhoon, driven toward the North American coast until it encountered the northwest trade winds, and then helplessly blown southward to the coast of Maui. It was late in the afternoon that word had been brought to Wakalana that a strange vessel was approaching the coast. As it was high out of water and drifting broadside before the wind, it appeared to be of great size, and little disposition was shown by the people to go out in their canoes to meet the mysterious monster. Wakalana hastened to the beach and, after watching the vessel intently for some time, saw that it was drifting slowly toward the rocky coast to the westward. Seaman enough to know that certain destruction awaited it in that direction, Wakalana hastily manned a stout canoe and started out to sea in pursuit. The waters were rough and his progress was slow, but he succeeded in reaching the vessel a few minutes after it struck the cliffs and was dashed in pieces. Seizing whatever they could find to assist them in floating, those on board leaped into the sea. It was hazardous to approach the wreck too nearly, but Wakalana succeeded in rescuing from the waves and returning to Wailuku with 5 persons, but not before he saw the last fragment of the wreck disappear in the abyss of raging waters. There is nothing in the names preserved, either of the vessel or its rescued passengers, to indicate their nationality. The name of the vessel is given as Mamala, which in the Hawaiian might mean a wreck or fragment. The name of the captain was Kalaunuiohua. The 4 others were called Nele Ike, Malai'a, Ha'akoa, and Hika, all names of Hawaiian construction. 2 of them, Nele Ike and Malai'a, were women, the former being the sister of the captain. They landed almost without clothing, and the only novelties upon their persons were the rings and bracelets of the women, and a sword in the belt of the captain, with which he had thoughtlessly leaped into the sea from the sinking vessel. They were half famished and weak, and by gestures expressed their gratitude to Wakalana for his gallantry in rescuing them, and asked for food and water. Both were provided in abundance, and 2 houses were set apart for their occupation. They attracted great attention, and people came from all parts of the island to see the white strangers. It was noted with astonishment by the natives that these men and women ate from the same vessels, and that nothing was especially taboo to either sex. But Vakalana explained that their gods doubtless permitted such freedom, and they should therefore not be rebuked for their apparent disregard of Hawaiian custom. The comfort of the strangers was made the especial care of Vakalana, and they soon became not only reconciled, but apparently content with their situation. But the kindness of the chief, however commendable, was not altogether unselfish. He was charmed with the bright eyes and fair face of Neleike, the sister of the captain. He found a pleasure that was new to him in teaching her to speak his language, and almost the first use she made of Oya was to say yes with it when he asked her to become his wife. Her marriage was followed by that of Ma Laia to a native chief, and of her brother and his 2 male companions to native women of good family. And here, as well as anywhere, it may be mentioned that, through her son Alo'oya, Neleike became the progenitor of a family which for generations showed the marks of her blood, and that the descendants of the others were plentiful thereafter, not only on Maui but in the neighborhood of Waimalo, on the island of Oahu. The object of the rescued Japanese, which attracted most attention, was the sword accidentally preserved by the captain. No such terrible knife had ever before been seen or dreamed of by the natives. They had pahoas, or daggers of wood or ivory, and knives of sharply broken flint and shark's teeth. They had stone adzes, axes, hatchets, and hammers, with which they could fell trees, hollow canoes from tree trunks, build houses, manufacture implements of war and industry, and hew stone of softer composition. They had spears and javelins with points of seasoned wood hard enough to splinter a bone. But iron and other metals had for ages been practically unknown to their race, and the long, sharp sword of the captain, harder than bone or seasoned wood, and from its polished surface, throwing defiantly back the bright rays of the sun, engaged their ceaseless wonder and admiration. As an ornament, they regarded it with longing, and when they learned that it was a weapon of war, they felt that the arm that wielded it in battle must be unconquerable. The captain did not see fit to disabuse the minds of the superstitious natives in their disposition to attribute a power of almost unlimited slaughter to the simple weapon. On the contrary, he rarely exhibited it except to distinguished chiefs, and in a few months it began to be mentioned as a sacred gift of the gods and pledge of victory to him who possessed it. Nor was the knowledge of the existence of a talisman so wonderful long confined to the windward side of Maui. The fame of the terrible weapon spread from Hana to Ka'anapali, and thence to the other islands of the group. And if but few of the many who came to learn the truth of the report were favored with a view of the sword, all saw, at least, the strange people who were pointed out as the bearers of it from an unknown land, and the story of its powers was readily accepted. But he who possessed it did not come as a conqueror, and, as he showed no disposition to use it offensively, the weapon ceased to be regarded with alarm. And now we will return to Kalaunuiohua and his army of conquest, last seen on their way to Maui in a fleet of 2,000 canoes. Sailing to the western division of the island, which was reached in 2 days, Kalaunuiohua effected a landing of his army at Lahaina. Kalaunuiohua, the moi of the island, had learned of the projected invasion some days before, and made every preparation possible to meet and repel it. Lunapais, or war messengers, had been dispatched to the several district chiefs, and an army of 7,000 or 8,000 warriors of all arms had been hastily collected. Vakalana had gone to the general defense with a force of 800 men, including Kalaunuiohua, the Japanese captain, upon whose presence great reliance was placed by the warriors of Wailuku if not by Vakalana himself. Unable to land at Lahaina, which was in possession of the enemy, Kalaunuiohua marched his forces across the mountains, and a sanguinary battle was fought in the neighborhood of the village. But the Mauians, greatly outnumbered, were defeated and driven back to the hills, and their king was taken prisoner. Throughout the battle, Kalaunuiohua was especially conspicuous for his might and courage. Armed with a huge stone axe, everything human seemed to fall before him, and where he led, the bravest alone followed, for he sought the very heart of danger. The conflict was drawing to a close. The Moi, gallantly fighting, had been taken prisoner, and his decimated battalions were steadily giving way, when Kalaunuiohua encountered a body of 200 or 300 men resolutely defending themselves behind a low stone wall. Several ineffectual attempts to dislodge them had been made, and they were sending forth shouts of victory and defiance. Something had inspired them with unusual courage and confidence. Did Kalaunuiohua divine what it was? Perhaps he did, for, hastily rallying to his support a force of sturdy warriors, he fought his way over the wall, and a determined hand-to-hand struggle followed. Meantime, a flanking party of spearsmen had made a circuit around the wall and were menacing its defenders in the rear. Observing the peril of the situation and that an effort was being made to cut off their retreat to the hills, the Mauians began to fall back. As they did so, Kalaunuiohua was seen to dash forward and precipitate himself, almost unsupported, upon a score or two of warriors who had apparently rallied to the assistance of some chief in distress. Regardless of danger, he hewed his way through the battling throng until he stood face to face with Kalaunuiohua, the white captain, in whose hand was the shining blade which had so nerved the arms of the warriors of Wailuku. With a blow of his battle-axe, he struck the sword from the upraised hand of the strange warrior. As it fell to the earth, he placed his foot upon it, and yielded no ground until the tide of battle swept around and past him, forcing to retreat the last to present a hostile front of the army of the captive king of Maui. Left alone for a moment by the wild pursuit of the flying enemy, Kalaunuiohua hurriedly stooped and thrust the sword into the earth, pressing it downward until the hilt was covered. Then, placing a large rock upon the spot, he left the field, numbering, as he went, his paces to the wall behind which the Mauians had sought protection. The victory was complete. The Moi was a prisoner, and such of his army as had not escaped to the hills lay dead on the field. The country was given over to pillage, and at sunset 20 prisoners were slain and sacrificed in a heiau near the village. The sacrifices were made to his war god, and Kalaunuiohua witnessed the solemn ceremonies of the offering. The night was spent in the wildest revelry by the victorious warriors, in the midst of which Kalaunuiohua sought his foster mother, who, with the women and non-combatants of the invading army, was encamped near the canoes on the beach. He hastily recited to her the events of the day, and concluded with the information that he had captured the long, bright knife of the strange chief of Wailuku, and, believing it to be of great value, had hidden it in the earth. At this intelligence the eyes of Waahia flashed with satisfaction. "You have done well," said the kaula, rising to her feet. "I have seen that long knife in my dreams. It will have much to do with your future, but it will be unsafe in your possession. Give it to me." "Give it to me at once," she repeated. "For should Kalaunuiohua by any chance learn that it was taken in battle, he will claim it." "But I am sure no one saw me hide it," replied Kalaunuiohua. "You talk like a boy," returned Waahia. "You must be sure of nothing of which there is a possibility of doubt. But no matter. It is not too dark to find the spot tonight. Let us go to it at once." Excited by her words, Kalaunuiohua now became no less anxious than the kaula that the sword should be placed in her keeping, and in an indirect way, to avoid observation, they repaired to the battlefield. Their only light was that of the stars, and after reaching the wall, it was some time before Kalu was able to identify the exact place to which he had extended the line of his hasty measurement. The ground was strewn with the naked bodies of the slain, and occasional groans came from a few whose struggles with death were not quite over. But no emotion, either of dread or pity, disturbed the visitors. Satisfied at length that he had found the desired place in the wall, Kalu took a careful bearing and then stepped briskly toward the north, closely followed by Waahia. Measuring 100 paces or more, he suddenly stopped, and with alarm discovered what seemed to be the form of a man crouching beside the rock, marking the spot where the sword had been buried. Grasping his pahoa, the only weapon he had brought with him, Kalu sprang forward and placed his hand upon the object. It was cold and motionless, and the young warrior smiled as the thought came to him that some one of the many who had fallen under his axe that day had possibly crawled to the spot to guard his treasure in death. He lifted the body aside, removed the stone, and the next moment pulled from the earth and handed to Waahia the iron blade. She grasped it eagerly, and, with a hasty glance at its bright blade glistening in the starlight, wrapped it securely in a piece of kapa and placed it under her mantle. Without attracting especial notice, they returned to the beach. When importuned by Kalu to tell him something definite of his future, Waahia revealed to him much that would happen, but all had not yet been given to her, and she admonished him to keep his lips closed and patiently await the development of the will of the gods. "I can see victories to come," said the kaula, "but in the end, defeat and disaster." "But if disaster is to come to us in the end," suggested Kalu, "why should it not mean defeat and death to me?" "I can give no reason why it should not, but the gods seldom explain their acts to mortals, and I am content in seeing your star shining above the ruin of Kalaunui." So spoke the kaula, and, cheered by her words, Kalu sought his tent of mats, and on a hard couch of kapa dreamed of a long, bright knife, and of battles in which he hewed down armies with it. Taking his royal captive with him, the second day after the battle, Kalaunui set sail with his army for the island of Molokai, of which Kahokuohua was the ali'i nui, or governing chief. No force adequate to cope with the invading army could be rallied, but the chivalrous descendant of the ancient kings of Hawaii was not a ruler to allow his subjects to be plundered without resistance, and, hastily gathering an army of 4,000 or 5,000 warriors, he gave the invaders battle at Kalaupapa. But he was defeated and taken prisoner, and after ravaging the country for miles around and destroying every captured canoe of which he could make no use, Kalaunui sailed for the conquest of Oahu with the 2 royal captives in his train. Waahia still accompanied the expedition, but the iron knife was not with her. The king had from some source learned that its glitter had been seen on the battlefield at Lahaina, and she had hidden it in a cleft of the black rocks of the Pali encircling Kalaupapa. As already stated, Oahu was at that time governed by a number of practically independent chiefs. The most powerful of these, and possibly recognized ali'i nui of the island, was Huapo'ulele, chief of the Iva and Waianae districts, to which division Kalaunui directed his fleet. Landing his forces at Waianae, a sanguinary battle was fought near that place, resulting in the defeat of the Oahuans and the capture of Huapo'ulele. Elated with his successes and deeming himself invincible, Kalaunui next prepared for a descent upon Kauai and the conquest of the entire group, but his plans for so formidable an undertaking were faulty. He took no steps to consolidate his conquests or maintain possession of the lands subdued by his arms. he left behind him no friend or stronghold on the conquered islands, blindly trusting, no doubt, that in the persons of his royal prisoners he retained, for the time being, a sufficiently firm hold upon their lands and subjects. Before embarking for Hawaii, elaborate sacrifices were offered, and every device known to the priesthood was exhausted to secure a continuance of the favor of the gods. The moi of that island was Kukona, the fourth in descent from the great Laya Mai Kahiki. Kalaunuiohua recognized that the defensive resources of Kauai were not to be despised, but he as greatly underrated the military abilities of Kukona as he overrated his own, and therefore did not doubt the result. Waahia saw disaster approaching, but knew that Kalaunuiohua would not listen to her voice of warning, and therefore remained silent when the kilos, anxious to please the king, shaped their inauspicious auguries into promises of victory. Her greatest solicitude was for Kwalu. He had been entrusted with an important command and could find no honorable pretext for declining to accept the hazard of the final struggle on Kauai. Waahia, therefore, did not advise him to remain, for she had seen his star shining above the clouds of defeat. She had sought frequent and earnest counsel of the mysterious intelligences of the earth and air. She had seen their answers in the smoke of burning incense, and within the circle of blood at midnight, when the moon was dark, had heard their whispers. Hence, it was with confidence that she said to Kwalu, on the evening before the departure of the fleet for Kauai, "Yes, you must go. I can be of no service to you where the air will be filled with spears, and the canoes will be painted red with blood. I will return to Hawaii. You will be defeated. Kukona is a brave and skillful warrior, and the army of Kalaunuiohua will be rent in pieces and thrown into the sea. The slaughter will be great, but circumstances will open a way, and you will escape." "And should I escape, where will I find you?" inquired Kwalu. "Among the owls in the old hut in Waipio," replied the kaula. "And the long knife?" "The long knife is where I alone can find it," answered Waahia. "Leave the secret to me. It will be of service to us yet." Early next morning the army of Kalaunuiohua set sail for Kauai, and with it, as prisoners, the mois of Maui and Molokai and the alii nui of Oahu. At the same time Waahia embarked for Hawaii, taking with her the war god of the king. Traditions differ concerning the circumstances under which the god was delivered to the prophetess. One asserts that she refused to hold her peace or leave the expedition without it. Another that the king, annoyed by her ill-omened words and presence, purchased her departure with it. And a third that it was given to her in deference to her declaration that, if taken to Kauai, it would not return, except at the head of a conquering army that would make a tributary kingdom of Hawaii. Certain it is, however, that Waahia returned to Hawaii from Oahu with the war god of the king. It was the sacred Aku Apa'au, or war god of Pa'au, and was held in great reverence by the priesthood. Borne over the waters by unseen forces, the canoe of Waahia was stranded on the beach at Koholalele, on the island of Hawaii. Not far off was the old heiau of Manini, and thither the god was conveyed, and placed in the custody of the high priest of the temple, with the injunction that it was never to be removed from the inner court, or sanctuary, unless the kingdom was in peril. 6 generations after it was taken from the heiau by the giant Maukaleoleo, and carried at the head of the victorious army of Umi, as mentioned in the legend of Umi, the peasant prince of Hawaii. 500 canoes had been added to the fleet of Kalaunuiohua, and the imposing squadron seemed to stretch half across the wide channel separating the two islands. A landing was made at Koloa, and the entire army disembarked without opposition. The district seemed to be deserted, and not a hostile spear was visible. And so continued the peaceful aspect until daylight the next morning, when Kuokona, supported by every prominent chief of Kauai, suddenly precipitated upon the invaders from the surrounding hills an army of 10,000 warriors. Nor this alone. Along the westward coast was seen approaching a fleet of nearly 1,000 war canoes, with the manifest design of capturing or destroying the canoes of the Hawaiians and cutting off their retreat by sea. Hastily forming his lines to meet the avalanche from the hills, Kalaunui dispatched Kualu to the beach, with a force of 3,000 warriors to protect the canoes. The attacks by land and sea were almost simultaneous, and the battle was one of the most stubborn and sanguinary ever fought in the group. As predicted by Waahia, the air was filled with spears, and the canoes were painted red with blood. Standing in the water to their hips, Kualu and his warriors met their enemies as they attempted to land, and a struggle of the wildest description followed. Canoes were upset. Men were hauled into them and killed, and out of them and drowned, and for a distance of 300 or 400 yards in the surf along the beach raged a desperate conflict, dreadful even to savage eyes. In their fury, they fought in, above, and under the water, and hundreds fiercely grappled, and without a wound sank to their deaths together. Neither would yield, and in the end resistance ceased, and Kualu saw the beach strewn with dead, 1,000 tenantless canoes idly playing with the surf, and less than as many hundreds of warriors left, as he had led thousands into the fight. He had saved the fleet, but the sacrifice of life had been terrible. Dispatching a messenger to the king and speedily reorganizing the remnant of his force, Kualu was about to leave the beach for service, where he might most be needed, when he discovered, with horror, that the Hawaiian army had been defeated, and in scattered fragments was seeking flight in all directions. Harassed by pursuit, 1,000 or more were fighting and struggling to reach the beach. Satisfied that the battle was lost, to facilitate the escape of the fugitives, Kualu ordered a large number of canoes to be hastily equipped and launched, and then started back to assist in covering the retreat. But his men refused to follow him. Knowing the danger of delay, all but a few of them leaped into canoes and paddled out to sea. As he could do nothing more, he selected a canoe suitable to the 4 persons who were to occupy it, and with his 3 remaining companions passed through the surf and headed for Oahu. Kualu did not escape a moment too soon. He had scarcely stemmed the surf before the fugitives, abandoning all defense, made a precipitate dash for the canoes, closely followed by their pursuers. In their haste, they shoved out in canoes, some of which were overburdened, and others but half-manned. A number of the former foundered in the surf, and such of the latter as succeeded in passing the breakers were overtaken by the canoes sent in pursuit. Nor did but few escape of the 200 or 300 who preceded Kualu in his flight. Some of them embarked in double canoes, which they were unable to manage, and others were either without sails or short of paddles. The result was that less than 100 of the fugitives escaped capture, and of that number probably not more than 20 or 30 succeeded in reaching the other islands of the group, for the sea was rough, and but few of them were skilled in navigation. Among these were Kualu and his companions. Almost from the beginning, the sudden attack of Kukona from the hills had been a slaughter. The withdrawal of 3,000 spears for the protection of his canoes had weakened the lines of Kalaunui at an exposed point, and, breaking through them, the Kauaians so vigorously followed up the advantage that no effort could save the Hawaiians from defeat. They fought bravely and with desperation, but the breaking of their lines had left them without any definite plan of action, and defeat was inevitable. Kalaunui's courage was conspicuous, but after an hour's hopeless struggle, he saw his brave battalions melting to the earth and giving way at all points. Recognizing that the battle was lost, and that what was left of his army would soon be in wild retreat, he attempted to cut his way through to the beach, but was intercepted and taken prisoner. Learning his rank, he was taken by his captors to Kukona, and a few minutes later the royal chiefs of Maui, Molokai, and Oahu, with their arms corded behind their backs, appeared on the scene. Deserted by their guards, they had been found in a hut not far from the beach, and brought to the victorious moi. It was a historic group, that meeting on the battlefield of Koloa of the 5 principal sovereigns of the archipelago. Had Kukona been ambitious, the means were at his command to become the supreme head of the island group. But he thought only of the future peace of Kauai, and promptly dismissed from his mind all dreams of broader fields of empire, well knowing that, were he able to seize the mastery of the group, he could not hope to long maintain it. Not a word of jeering or of triumph passed between Kalaunuiohua and the captive chiefs as they stood before Kukona, for the Aha Ali'i of the period, the chiefs of accepted rank, commanded the respect, not only of the untitled, but of each other, even in bondage and in death. Kukona had met the Ali'i Nui of Oahu in his own dominions some years before, and recognized him at once, but the kings of Maui and Molokai were strangers to him. Being informed of their rank and the circumstances of their captivity, he ordered them to be liberated at once, and with his own hands removed the cords from the arms of his royal friend from Oahu. The rescued princes were at once returned with befitting escorts to their own possessions, but Kalaunuiohua was retained as a prisoner of war. But few of the invading army escaped. The victory was celebrated with elaborate sacrifices and general rejoicing throughout the island. The captured arms and canoes were divided among the assisting chiefs, and peace reigned again on Kauai. Kukona had secured the lasting friendship of the chiefs of Oahu, Maui, and Molokai, and therefore did not fear the retaliation of Hawaii. But, as a guarantee of peace, he kept Kalaunuiohua a prisoner, rightly surmising that, if the ruling powers of Hawaii really valued the life of the captive king, they would not imperil it by attempting his release by force, and if they did not greatly value it, he would be left to his fate or the chances of peaceful negotiation. 3. Escaping from Koloa, Kualu and his companions made sail for Hawaii, stopping for supplies at such intermediate points as they deemed safe on the coasts of Oahu, Molokai, and Maui, and on the evening of the 6th day arrived at Waipio. They were the first to bring to Hawaii the news of the defeat of Kalaunuiohua on Kauai, and when the people learned that the army had been destroyed, the land was filled with wailing. Appearing at once before Kaheka and her son, Kualu recited to them the story of the dreadful battle, but was unable to tell them definitely of the fate of Kalaunuiohua. The grief of the queen was great, and found strange and unreasonable expression in charging Kualu with cowardice and ordering him from the palace. In vain he protested against the ungenerous treatment. She had never liked him, especially since discovering that he had secured something more than the goodwill of Kapapa, and it seemed monstrous to her that he should have survived Kalaunuiohua and the scores of gallant chiefs who fell with him. She cruelly intimated that it was more than probable that, with the force sent to protect the fleet, he had embarked in the canoes without striking a blow, thus treacherously depriving the defeated army of its sole means of escape. Had these monstrous charges been made by a man, Kualu would have answered them with blows. But, as they were the foolish and inconsiderate ravings of a woman, without venturing further reply, he took his leave, and with a heart filled with stifled rage and anguish strode from the palace. Proceeding up the valley, Kualu entered the hut of Waahia. He found the kaula alone, as usual. She knew he was coming, but was nonetheless rejoiced to meet him. With a word or two of greeting, he sat down in silence. The cruel words of Kaheka still stuck like thorns in his throat. Waahia regarded him intently for a time, and then said, "I know it all. Kalaunui's army has been destroyed. You escaped in a canoe with 3 others." "And Kalaunui?" questioned Kualu, not a little amazed at the correctness of her information. "Is a prisoner," replied the kaula. "Thank the gods for that," exclaimed the chief vehemently. "He must be liberated, for he can tell her that in escaping I acted neither with cowardice nor treachery." "Tell whom?" inquired the kaula. "Kaheka," answered Kualu. "She charges me with cowardice and desertion." "Then Kaheka accuses you of what I know to be false," said Waahia. "Yes," returned the chief, "but the witnesses to my fidelity are few and humble, and the words of the king can alone relieve me in the eyes of the Aha Ali'i of the disgrace with which the charges of Kaheka will cover me." "True," replied the kaula encouragingly, "but the disgrace will not be lasting, for the king will return to do you justice." "When will he return?" eagerly inquired the chief. "I cannot tell," answered Waahia, "but I know that his rule is not yet at an end in Hawaii, and you must be patient." And Kualu promised to be patient, and for a few days bore the neglect and frowns of his former friends, and the sneers and covert insults of his enemies. But when the heartless accusations of Kaheka, passing from tongue to tongue with the news of the dreadful slaughter, became generally known, and almost as generally believed, notwithstanding the statements of his 3 companions. To the contrary, Kualu's indignation could no longer be restrained, and he challenged to combat and slew on the spot a chief who, in the presence of a party of friends, repeated the charges to his face. Great excitement followed, and in his desperation and wrath, Kualu invited the friends of his fallen defamer, one and all, to test his courage, then or thereafter. As the life of Kualu was now in constant and undoubted peril, Waahia advised him to leave Hawaii for a time, and together they set sail for Molokai, and took up their residence at Kalaupapa. But before leaving Waipio, the kaula called upon the high priest, by whom she was held in great respect, and told him where she might be found on Molokai, should her services be required. "And they will be required," said Waahia, significantly. "Kalaunui is not dead, and when you shall have failed in all your efforts to liberate him, tell Kaheka to think better of Kualu, and send for me." "How know you that Kalaunui still lives?" inquired the priest. "Should the high priest of Pakaalani ask me that question?" replied Waahia. "Where are his seers? Where are the kilos of the temple? Who in the heavens saw victory for Kalaunui where I beheld defeat? Have they not been consulted?" "All do not see with the eyes of Waahia," returned the priest evasively. Flattered by this recognition of her superiority, the kaula said, as she turned to depart, "You will know more tomorrow." And an hour after, accompanied by Kualu, she left Waipio for Molokai. The priest was not deceived by Waahia, for the day after authentic intelligence was received from Maui to the effect that Kalaunui's campaign had been a failure in Kauai, and the king was a prisoner in the hands of Kukona. The leading chiefs were called together in council, and several projects for the liberation of the king were advanced and discussed. Kaheka was in favor of raising a powerful army at once and bringing her royal husband back by force. But when it was considered by cooler heads that Kukona was undoubtedly well prepared for war and had secured the friendship, and in an emergency could command the support of the chiefs of Maui, Oahu, and Molokai, the suggestion was dismissed as dangerous and impracticable. Under the circumstances, it was finally resolved to attempt the liberation of Kalaunui through negotiation, and to this end messengers were dispatched to Kauai with offers of a large number of canoes, spears, and other war materials in exchange for the royal prisoner. But the surrender of Kalaunui's fleet and the capture of thousands of spears and other arms had given Kukona a great abundance of both, and he declined the offer. Failing in this, after a lapse of some months, messengers were again sent to Kukona with a proffer of 20 full-sized mamos, or royal feather cloaks, a canoe-load of ivory and whalebone, and 1,000 stone lipas, or axes, of a superior kind peculiar to Hawaii. The messengers were courteously received and listened to, but the offer was not accepted. War was again urged by Kaheka, but the chiefs refused to embark in an undertaking so hazardous, and without their support, she could do nothing. And so for more than 2 years, Kalaunui remained in captivity, when a third attempt to ransom him was made. Kaheka dispatched to Kauai 2 ambassadors of high rank, offering her daughter Kaapapa in marriage, either to Kukona or his son Mano Kalanipo, and promising perpetual peace between the islands. This offer was also declined, and Kukona refused to name to the ambassadors the terms upon which he would treat for the liberation of their king. It now became a question either of war or the abandonment of Kalaunui to his fate. In this dilemma, the priests and kaulas were consulted, but their predictions were vague and their counsels unsatisfactory. Remembering the words of Waahia, the high priest sought the presence of Kaheka and advised her to send for the old prophetess, who was living with her foster son at Kalaupapa. This, after some persuasion, she consented to do, and, dispatching a chief of high rank to Molokai, with the admission that she had accused Kwalu unjustly, the kaula was induced to return with the messenger to Waipio. But Kwalu did not accompany her. She was suspicious of Kaheka and advised him to remain at Kalaupapa. Arriving at Waipio, the kaula, feeling that the game was now in her own hands, informed the high priest that she would communicate with the leading chiefs of the kingdom convened in council. The chiefs were accordingly assembled, and Waahia appeared before them. Kaheka was present, as the kaula desired. With a staff in her hand, capped with the head of an owl, and her long white hair falling to her waist, there was something weird and awe-inspiring in the appearance of the venerable prophetess as she entered the council room and bowed low before Kaheka and the assembled chiefs. It was not her privilege to break the silence without permission, and when it had been formally accorded, she raised her eyes and, without especially addressing anyone, said, "Why have I been sent for?" No one could answer, not even Kaheka. At length, an old chief, after conferring with those around him, replied, "You have been sent for on the word of the high priest, and with the hope that you might be able to point out a way for the return of Kalaunui to Hawaii. Can you do so?" "I can speak of no way," answered the kaula. "Then you can do nothing," returned the chief. "My words were that I could speak of no way, nor can I," said the kaula. "Yet, keeping my own counsel, I might possibly be able to accomplish what you all desire." "And will you undertake to do so?" inquired Kaheka. "Yes, on one condition," was the prompt reply. "Well, what do you ask for attempting to save the life of your king?" returned the queen, in a tone of rebuke. Waahia did not like the spirit of the inquiry, and a scowl darkened her wrinkled face as she replied, "I might ask that, if the gods willed that I should fail, Kaheka would not charge me with treachery." This reference to the treatment of Kwalu created a feeling of uneasiness among the chiefs. But, without inviting remark or explanation, the kaula continued. "What I require is a pledge from every chief here that should I succeed in liberating Kalaunui, the terms of the release, whatever they may be, will be complied with." The chiefs hesitated, as it was not impossible that the sovereignty of the island might be offered to Kukona by the prophetess, and they could not pledge themselves to a sacrifice involving their own ruin. Waahia relieved their apprehensions, however, by assuring them that the pledge would not be considered binding if the terms affected either the sovereignty of the island or the lives, possessions, or prerogatives of its chiefs. With this assurance, the members of the council, after briefly discussing the possibilities of the obligation, consented to accept it. Thereupon, the pledge was carefully repeated thrice by the chiefs, and each in turn solemnly invoked upon himself, should he fail to keep and observe it in its fullness, the wrath of Hika Poloa, the divine trinity, and the swift and especial vengeance of Kwahana, the slayer of men. "Are you satisfied now?" inquired Kaheka. "I am satisfied," replied the kaula. "Do you require assistance?" This inquiry came from more than one. "Only of the gods," was the impressive answer of Waahia as she left the council and slowly wended her way up the valley. All night long, strange lights flashed at intervals through the weather-rent openings in the kaula's hut. Shadowy forms were seen to move noiselessly around it. Owls came and went as the lights vanished and reappeared. And just as the sun began to paint the east, Waahia proceeded to the beach, and with a single sturdy assistant of supernatural aspect, embarked in a canoe, which seemed to be equipped and provisioned for a long voyage. This was the ghostly narration of 2 or 3 of the nearest neighbors of the prophetess, and the truth of the story was not doubted, even when it reached the palace. Doubtless the plain facts were that Waahia spent the most of the night in preparing for the voyage and set sail early in the morning with an assistant known to be trustworthy and familiar with the sea. Waahia proceeded very leisurely to Kauai. The annual feast of Lono was approaching, and as she desired to arrive there during the festival, which would not be for some days, she spent the intervening time in visiting many sacred spots and noted temples on Maui, Oahu, Molokai, and Lanai. Perhaps to commune with the honored dead, she made a pilgrimage to the sacred valley of I'au, on the island of Maui, where were buried many of the distinguished kings and chiefs of the group. She stopped at Kalaupapa, on Molokai, to confer with Kwalu, and while there paid a visit to the home near Kaluakoi of La'amaumau, the wind god who came from the south with Moikeha more than a century before, and in the same valley visited the dreaded spot where, in the reign of Kama'uaua, the father of Kaupeepee, the abductor of Hina, near the close of the 11th century, sprang up in a night the poisoned grove of Kalaipahoa, or, according to another tradition, where that goddess, belonging to a family of southern deities, visited the group with 2 of her sisters, and entered and poisoned a small grove of trees of natural growth. From one of these poisonous trees, the famous idol of Kalaipahoa was made. So poisonous was the wood that many died in cutting down the tree and carving the image, for all perished whose flesh was touched by the chips. But the workmen finally covered their bodies with kapa, including masks for their faces and wraps for their hands, and thus succeeded in completing the dangerous task without farther loss of life. But a single image was made. It remained with the ruling family of Molokai until the subjugation of the group by Kamehameha the Great, when it came into his possession and, at his death in 1819, was divided among a few of the principal chiefs. Two fragments of the image, it is said, are still preserved, but they are carefully guarded and never exhibited to eyes skeptical or profane. Long before Waahia visited the spot, the last vestige of the grove had disappeared, but for many acres around, where the terrible trees once stood, the earth was black and bare. Within the dreaded area, no living thing was seen, and birds fell dead in flying over it. But the kaula entered it and returned unharmed, to the amazement of more than one witness. Waahia next visited the hei'o of Kaumolu, which was then a puho nua, or place of refuge, and in another temple near the coast offered sacrifices to the shark god Mo'oali'i. By reputation, she was generally known to the priesthood of the group, and was nowhere regarded as an intruder in places sacred to worship. Stopping at Iva, on the island of Oahu, she saw for the first time the hallowed enclosure of Kukani Loko, the creation of Nana Ka'oko, son of Nana Ma'oa, the earliest arrival from the south of the migratory stream of the 11th century. Chiefs born there were endowed with especial prerogatives and distinctions, and the beating of a sacred drum called havea gave notice without of the birth of a taboo chief. 4. The winter solstice, which marked the end of the Hawaiian year, was at hand, to be followed by the usual 5 days' feast of Lono, and Waahia so timed her voyage as to arrive on Kauai the day before the festival began. She quietly landed at Koloa, and as far as possible avoided observation by taking up her residence in a small hut secured by her companion well back in the neighboring hills. These annual festivals of Lono were seasons of universal merriment and rejoicing. The god was crowned and ornamented with leis of flowers and feathers, and unstinted offerings of pigs, fowls, and fruits were laid upon the altars of the temples consecrated to his worship. Chiefs and people alike gave themselves unreservedly over to feasting, dancing, singing, and the indulgence of almost every appetite and caprice, and the Saturnalias of the old Romans gave to the masses scarcely more license than the festivals of Lono. Every instrument of music known to the people, and they possessed but 4 or 5 of the simplest kinds, was brought into requisition, and for 5 days there was almost an uninterrupted tumult of revelry. Lakakane, the hula god, was decorated and brought out, and every variety of the dance was given, some of them to the time of vocal recitations, and others to the noisier accompaniment of pipes, drums, and rattling calabashes. In the midst of these enjoyments, long-bearded bards appeared before the king and distinguished chiefs, and while some of them recited wild historic tales of the past, others chanted the Mele Inoas and sang of the personal exploits of their titled listeners. Ava and other intoxicating drinks were freely indulged in by those who craved them, and the festivals were usually followed by a week or more of general languor and worthlessness. It was the 3rd day of the festival at Koloa. The gates of the enclosure had been thrown open, and thousands of people thronged around the royal mansion in a grove near which large quantities of refreshments were spread on the ground in huge wooden trays and calabashes. The feast was free to all, and Kukona lounged on a pile of kapa in the deep shade of the trees in front of the palace, happy in witnessing the enjoyment of his subjects. Around him were standing a number of chiefs of high rank. A kahili of bright feathers was occasionally and unobtrusively waved above his head by the pa'akahili, and the iwi kuamo'o, aipu'upu'u, and other of his personal attendants, all of the lesser nobility, stood in readiness to respond to his slightest wishes. A guard of inferior chiefs kept the crowd from pressing too closely the distinguished group, but from time to time, as permission was granted, select bands of dancers and musicians and chanters of ability were allowed to approach and entertain the royal party with specimens of their skill and erudition. A company of dancers had just retired when Waahia, with a staff in her hand and wearing a short mantle indicating that she claimed privileges of dress which were not accorded to women generally, asked permission to be admitted to the presence of the king. Her strange appearance excited the curiosity of Kukona, and she was allowed to approach. Kneeling and touching her forehead to the ground, she rose and asked if it was the pleasure of the king to hear her. As these ceremonies, due to supreme authority, were usually waived on such occasions, it was surmised that the woman must be a stranger in Kauai. She was told to speak. A mo'oelo, or historic chant, was expected, but in a full, sharp voice she chanted these words: "Oh, the long knife of the stranger from other lands, of the stranger with sparkling eyes, of the stranger with a white face. O long knife of Lono, the gift of Lono. It flashes like fire in the sun. Its edge is sharper than stone, sharper than the hard stone of Hu'alalai. The spear touches it and breaks. The strong warrior sees it and dies. Where is the long knife of the stranger? Where is the sacred gift of Lono? It came to Wailuku and is lost. It was seen at Lahaina and cannot be found. He is more than a chief who finds it. He is a chief of chiefs who possesses it. Maui cannot spoil his fields. Hawaii cannot break his nets. His canoes are safe from Kauai. The chiefs of Oahu will not oppose him. The chiefs of Molokai will bend at his feet. O long knife of the stranger, O bright knife of Lono. Who has seen it? Who has found it? Has it been hidden away in the earth? Has the great sea swallowed it? Does the kilo see it among the stars? Can the kaula find it in the bowels of the black hog? Will a voice from the Anu answer? Will the priests of Lono speak? The kilo is silent, the kaula is dumb. O long knife of the stranger, O bright knife of Lono. It is lost, it is lost, it is lost. At the conclusion of the chant, which was listened to with attention, the kaula bowed and disappeared in the crowd. Kukona had heard of the long knife, and Waahia's description of its powers interested him greatly. He dispatched a messenger to the high priest, ordering that the diviners at once be put to the task of discovering the hiding place of the sacred weapon. On the following afternoon, Waahia appeared before the king and his chiefs, and with the same ceremonies repeated her chant of the day before. The high priest was summoned and informed the king that his diviners had as yet discovered no trace of the long knife. The third day, Waahia appeared and repeated her chant before the king, and silently withdrew, as before. Again the high priest was summoned, but was able to offer no assurance that the long knife would be found by the kahunas. They had resorted to every means of inspiration and magic known to them, but could discover no clue to the mystery. Who is this woman, who for 3 successive days has told us of the lost knife? Inquired Kukona, addressing the chiefs surrounding him. No one seemed to be able to answer. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped forward and replied, "The woman, I think, is Waahia, the noted prophetess of Hawaii. I saw her 15 years ago in Waipio, and am quite sure that I remember her face." The name, if not the face, of the distinguished seeress was known to the king and many others present, and the high priest, anxious to explain the failure of his magicians, bowed and said, "The master of ceremonies has doubtless spoken truly. The woman must be Waahia. Her powers are great, and a secret in her keeping is beyond the reach of the kaulas. Accepting this explanation of the high priest, Kukona ordered the prophetess to be found and respectfully conducted to the royal mansion. But after a fruitless search of 2 days, it was reported that she had probably left the valley, and therefore could not be found. Irritated at what seemed to be the inefficiency or neglect of his kaulas and chiefs, Kukona was about to attach a death penalty to further failure when Waahia suddenly entered the royal enclosure and approached the palace. Her appearance was most welcome to the attending chiefs, and she was ushered at once into the presence of the king. So delighted was Kukona at the unexpected visit that he rose unconsciously to his feet and greeted the prophetess. This breach of courtly form amazed the attendants of the king and suggested to them that the strange visitor must be of supreme rank. But before any explanation could be gathered, they were ordered to retire, even to the Pa'akahili, and Kukona was left alone with the kaula. The king motioned his visitor to a lounge of kapa, for she seemed to be old and feeble, and he had a favor to ask. Seating herself as requested, the king approached and, in a voice that could not well be overheard, said, "Are you Waahia, the prophetess of Hawaii?" "I am Waahia," answered the kaula. "You have chanted of the long knife of the stranger, of the bright knife of Lono, of the lost knife of Wailuku," resumed Kukona. "Our diviners can give me no information concerning it." Waahia smiled significantly, but made no reply, and the king continued, "They say you have tabooed the secret, and others, therefore, cannot share it. Is it so?" "Perhaps," was the brief reply. "Then you can find the sacred knife?" eagerly suggested Kukona. "I can find it," was the kaula's emphatic answer. "Then find and bring it to Kukona, and for the service claim what you will," was the prompt proposal of the king. With the way thus broadly opened, Waahia announced that the price of the knife must be the liberation of Kalaunui, and was astonished at the promptness with which the terms were accepted. It was manifest to Waahia that he either placed a very high value upon the talisman or had kept his royal prisoner about as long as he cared to detain him, or the peace of his kingdom required. In either event, his unhesitating acceptance of the main consideration warranted Waahia in at once naming 1 or 2 other conditions, which were just as promptly agreed to by the king. One of these conditions was that Kalaunui should agree, as the only consideration for his release to be known to him, that his daughter Ka-Papa should be given in marriage to the chief Kwalu, not only as a fitting union, but as a measure of atonement for the unjust and disgraceful charges made against that worthy young chief by Kaheka, and that Kukona and Kalaunui should mutually pledge themselves to the fulfillment of the compact. The other condition was that, on the delivery of the knife to Kukona, he was to release the captive king at once and return him to Hawaii in company with 3 high chiefs of Kauai, who were to remain in Waipio until after the consummation of the marriage of Ka-Papa and Kwalu. Kalaunui was communicated with. For nearly 3 years he had been confined and closely but respectfully guarded within a square of high stone walls enclosing a single hut. Utterly unable to account for Kukona's interest in Kwalu, he nevertheless accepted the terms submitted to him for his release, and Waahia started at once for Kalaupapa, promising to be back within 6 days. For the voyage, she accepted a canoe larger and more commodious than her own, and the services of 5 additional rowers. Arriving at Kalaupapa on the morning of the 3rd day from Koloa, Waahia startled Kwalu by informing him that Kalaunui was about to be released, and that in 12 days he must return without further notice to Waipio, where he would be relieved of all disgrace by the king, and become the husband of Kaapapa. Coming from Waahia, he believed the words as if they had been flashed from the heavens, and asked for no confirmation, as the kaula abruptly left him and proceeded alone toward the hills. A few hours later, Waahia re-embarked for Kauai, taking with her, securely wrapped in a number of kapa folds, the sword of Kaluiki. She reached Koloa within the time promised, and, proceeding to the palace, delivered to the king, in person and alone, the glittering blade which rumor had clothed with extraordinary sanctity and power. Kalaunui renewed his pledge to Kukona, and the next morning embarked for Hawaii in a large double canoe, accompanied by 3 of the leading chiefs of Kauai and their attendants. Stepping into the kaulua as it was about to be shoved into the surf, Kalaunui caught sight of Waahia for the first time for years, as she stood leaning upon her staff near the water. Kwalu's part in the agreement with Kukona was explained at once by Waahia's presence in Koloa. But what was Kwalu to Kukona? And, if nothing, what influences had the kaula been able to bring to effect his release upon such conditions? No matter. Kalaunui was too happy in his liberation to quarrel with the means through which it had been secured, and he turned with a look of gratitude toward the prophetess as the canoe shot out into the breakers. The return of their captive king was joyously celebrated by the people of Hawaii, and a few days after Kaapapa became the willing wife of Kwalu. The union was distasteful to Kaheka, but she was powerless to prevent it. The agreement was faithfully fulfilled by Kalaunui, and he spent the remainder of his days in peace, leaving the kingdom to his only son, Kwaiva, between whom and Kwalu a lasting friendship was established. Kwalu, with Kaapapa, became the head of an influential family, one of his direct descendants having been the wife of Makaoku, a son of Kiha and brother of Liloa, one of the most noted of the kings of Hawaii. The sword of Kaluiki, the ransom of a king, remained for some generations with the descendants of Kukona, but what became of it in the end, tradition fails to tell.